Speaking of projects to try to transform human nature and restructure society, the Frankfurt School is often mentioned in that connection. And people see that as the root of much of the cultural subversion that we see around us in the West at the moment. And you point out rightly, I think, that the Frankfurt School flourished more in the United States than it had in interwar Germany. And many of its core ideas about combating prejudice and the authoritarian personality became so profoundly Americanized that they informed American concepts of democracy. I think that is a perspective that people don't often hear, the idea that the Frankfurt School is in some sense homegrown in the US. How did that happen and why?
Well, I argue this in several of my books. It's interesting you raised this point because my editor, acquisition editor, asked me to write this book for Cornell in NIU Press. They've merged now. She found that idea absolutely unsettling and not entirely convincing. She says, isn't this a German thing? And I said, well, and then after 1933, it became an American thing. These people moved here, and they were based in New York. Columbia University set up a special thing for the Institute for Social Research for Sozialforschung, and next to Columbia University. It came out sort of integrated into the university. And many of these people end up practicing psychiatry or psychology in New York. I mean, Erich Fromm is one of the most radical members of the Frankfurt School who enjoys enormous success in the United States. Karen Harney, there are other members of this group. And I remember reacting strongly to a statement in Alan Bloom's book on the closing of the American mind. He speaks about how the Germans, foreign ideas were brought over here and corrupted us. Well, in the case of the Frankfurt School, most of the corruption set in here. And then after the war, we moved them back in 1950 to Frankfurt. And, they had tremendous influence on re-educating Germans, and turning them into the basket cases they've become. One of the reasons it's well established in the United States is because the idea of democratic social engineering takes root in the United States in the early 20th century, right? It goes back to the progressive era. You have people like Simon Martin Lipset, this Cold War liberal sociologist, who absolutely loves the authoritarian personality, which is published in the United States in English, in 1950. So he thinks that this is a great work. It's just that Adorno and Horkheimer were not sufficiently aware that communists could also have authoritarian personalities. They were just talking about fascism. So the Americans can make their peace with this. The only thing they didn't like about the Frankfurt School was that some of its members were very sympathetic to communism, and they got dragged before the House Un-American Activities Committee and so forth. But at the same time, they did enjoy great vogue among, within the American Academy. And they leave their mark on what becomes the fascist scale that is used in the United States in testing people for civil service and education. There's a fascism scale that is introduced in the 1950s. Then it gets updated in the 1970s. And basically they're testing people to make sure they don't have dangerous right-wing personalities. Now, this was being done throughout the anti-communist period of the Cold War, which people sometimes are not aware of. And at least liberal anti-communists were not opposed to this because they saw the communists as, as red fascists, essentially, as I argue. So the Frankfurt School became, quickly very, I'm thinking in German, sie wurden das eingebürgert. They became like domesticated or Americanized. And of course, during the Second World War, they were very important because they were all working, to uncover fascist personalities so that we could fight the fascists in Europe. The idea that somehow, that this is extraneous to the United States, I think is, for me, a very unconvincing argument.
What would you say is the clearest flowering of that tradition today, beyond obviously the use of fascism as a term designed to stamp out debate on particular topics?
Well, I think what happens, in the second generation of the Frankfurt School, which is more radical. The one that goes back in Germany, people like Habermas are typical of that second generation. They're much more radical in some ways. They not only, buy into the anti-capitalist socialist argument, and they're not only interested in reconstructing the family. In Germany, they're very anti-nationalist. They're fanatically anti-German. They're the people who are now in power. You see the influence of the second generation of the Frankfurt School. The second generation is also open to LGBT. The first generation, I argue, my book is really not. I mean, they favor tolerance for gays, and they think women should be in professions and so forth. They're not really that radical. I mean, as I say, they're somewhere to the right of what in America is the conservative movement right now, but they're not that, believe me. Herbert Marcuse was my professor, and he looked upon feminism, he looked askance at feminism, even if he defended the Soviet Union and didn't think Stalin was a bad fellow. But he was very upset by, and I'm sure he would have been absolutely unsettled by the presence of gays. But I think it's the second generation that is much more radical. I also don't think they're quite as they're not as anti-capitalist or socialist, but they're into social engineering, and into gay rights and so forth. This is much more characteristic, of the people who come to the United States. And then the Frankfurt School that is reestablished in Germany, particularly under Adorno, not so much Horkheimer in the 1950s.